Hello everyone, I'm Caitlin Teeter, and on today's Teeter Tales, I'm going to be doing a review of Tales from Watership Down, a short story collection by Richard Adams that serves as a sequel to Watership Down. This book was actually published 24 years after the original novel, so if you're like me, you may not have realized that Watership Down even had a sequel. Since this is a sequel to Watership Down, I will be giving full spoilers for the novel, but I will try and let you know when I go into spoilers for this collection, and I'll have timestamps in the description for you to skip those spoilers. This review is going to be structured a little bit differently than some of my others, as I'm going to separate talking about the first and second halves of this book. The first half is mostly just El-ahrairah stories, and the second half is stories about Hazel and the other rabbits. You can find these sections in the description, so let's get started. The first half of this book is comprised of stories told by the rabbits on the down. Each chapter tells a different story, and most of them are about El-ahrairah. This part essentially serves as a collection of rabbit folklore. The second half of this collection is stories about Hazel and the other rabbits on the down, in the following year after General Woundwort's defeat. There are a couple overarching stories throughout this section, but there are also chapters that serve as individual narratives. I will be completely honest, I did not care for the first half of this collection. While the El-ahrairah stories weren't terrible, they were not nearly as interesting as the stories about Hazel and the other rabbits, so I found myself wanting to skip past them and get to the latter half of the book. As for the individual stories, I found that many of them felt out of place within the context of a rabbit warren. One story in particular, The Sense of Smell, had so much information that rabbits wouldn't know or wouldn't care about, such as the details of extinct species, that it completely took me out of the story. It felt like Adams had messages that he wanted to share, such as the tragedy of extinction, but then didn't stop to consider if it was relevant at all to rabbits telling the story. This made the world building in many of these stories feel off. El-ahrairah stories should add to the culture or lore of the rabbits, but most of the stories simply existed. There was even a story towards the end of the first half in which the rabbits were the villains, which again seems like something that rabbits would not be telling to each other. El-ahrairah's solutions in these stories were often less clever and more random or lucky. While this was an issue in a few of the stories in the novel, El-ahrairah stories really should rely on cleverness and intelligence, not on random circumstances. Because of all this, I would actually recommend that readers skip the first two sections of this book. Unless you love the rabbit folklore, there's not really a reason to read these stories, as the latter half of the book is much better. The only stories which I would suggest maybe taking the time to read are the rabbit's ghost story and the story of the comical field. I might also add The Hole in the Sky because it's interesting, but it's also a very weird story. The latter half of this book is much better, though I did still have my issues with it. For one, the rabbits don't seem quite as animal-like as they do in the novel. This collection was published more than 2 decades after the novel, so I'm not surprised if Adams' style had changed a bit. The collection does feature some welcome modern updates, such as removing some of the uncomfortable racial comments of the original novel, but other elements that were updated removed this collection even further from the original story. In the original book, does, or female rabbits, were often more animalistic and not nearly as important as the male rabbits. This was criticized, and it seems Adams has taken that critique to heart. The entire plotline of the latter half of this collection is a warren that's run entirely by does. I'm going to have some spoilers for the collection in this section. This is shown to be a viable system and results in Hazel making Heisenflay the second chief rabbit of the Watership Down warren. I actually really like Heisenflay as a character, and under other circumstances, I would be happy with her becoming a chief rabbit. The problem is how this is executed in the book. It's almost as if the rabbits are intentionally upsetting their social norms by making Heisenflay a chief rabbit, which seems very human and not in the nature of the rabbits. I did appreciate Adams making the does more active and giving them more important roles, but making Heisenflay another chief rabbit just undermines Hazel's role as the chief rabbit and seems unnecessary. This is made all the worse by Bluebell's comment when asked about the chief rabbit, when he says, "Male or female, we cater to all tastes here, you know." Another point in this collection that was taken too far is the supernatural elements. Fiver worked really well in the original book because he was one of the only rabbits to have visions, and they were sporadic, so it made him special and made it more mysterious. This book uses visions and other strange supernatural happenings a lot, and rabbits other than Fiver have these visions. This makes things feel simultaneously less mysterious while also making this world feel less real. Those are the most obvious discrepancies from the novel, but there were a few other minor elements that took me out of the story. One example is the story of Stonecrop, and there will be some spoilers for this chapter. Stonecrop is a rabbit who is wild-born but raised in a hutch. And when he shows up at the warren, the rabbits immediately try to kill him because he smells like man. This doesn't make sense because an entire plotline in the original novel features Hazel and the other rabbits going to break several domesticated rabbits out of a hutch to bring to their warren. They try and explain this with Fiver making a comment about how Stonecrop just smells more like man than the hutch rabbits did, but that's an unsatisfying explanation and feels like Adams is just trying to ignore what has happened previously so that he can tell a new story. This is an admittedly enjoyable, interesting story, but I was still disappointed at how it disregarded previous events. The last critique I'll give of this section is the organizational elements. The first several chapters track a single storyline, but rather than wrapping up that story, Adams just drops it as soon as it moves outside of the scope of the Watership Down Warren. This made that whole plotline feel very incomplete. The final chapter of this book switches to a different character outside of the Warren, and ends the big dramatic paragraph about the significance of that character. This felt like it should have been a middle chapter and not the chapter to conclude the Watership Down story. Really, many of my faults for this collection tie back to the novel. Since this is supposed to be a continuation of Watership Down, I must judge it in relation to the novel. The writing of these stories is still well done, it just doesn't live up to the writing of the novel. All in all, the latter half of this collection makes for a fun group of stories that I read very quickly. Adams keeps up a fast pace, so I was able to get through the second half in just 2 sittings. The stories were engaging, but not nearly as thought-provoking as the original. Those familiar with Watership Down will know what to expect from the content of this collection. The violence gets to the same intensity, but not nearly as frequent as the novel. Rabbits will bite and claw one another, sometimes with the intent to kill. The most visceral point was when a cat was described as having its middle torn open and dragging itself away with its insides hanging out. There's also a story where a human body is unearthed in the woods. Some rabbits contract horrible diseases, and those effects are described. Sexual content is frequent but never descriptive, because rabbits will discuss mating, choosing mates, and producing offspring. So that is the focus of many of the stories, but again, never graphic. The language in this book consists of just one mild profanity, the D word, and it doesn't pop up frequently unless Tihar is involved, because he says it a lot. The rabbits have a general spirituality to them, and occasionally will pray to Frith, the sun, or El-ahrairah. They'll also tell ghost stories which are assumed to be true, and some rabbits have visions. I was really looking forward to this collection of stories, as Watership Down is one of my favorite books. Though I didn't expect it to be as good as the novel, I still had mixed feelings by the time I finished this book. The first half was pretty painful to get through. I just wanted to read about Hazel and the others, so the El-ahrairah stories were more of an obstacle than an enjoyment. Once I got to the Watership Down stories, I found that they were fast-paced and held my interest, but many of the elements did not match up to the novel. Because of this, I would recommend that those who want to read this collection just skip the first 2 sections and go straight to the latter half. While the stories are not up to the quality of the original novel, they're still very fun and give a more casual look at the lives of the Watership Down rabbits. I know I have had a lot of critiques for this book, but that's because I love the original novel so much. I did genuinely enjoy the latter half of this book, even if I can recognize it has many flaws. I hope you enjoyed this review and that it was helpful in deciding if you'll read this collection. Thanks for watching. Bye!